Hi there, and well, thanks for coming. I know this is a bit tough the first day after the break to come to an evening talk, but this is with a great pleasure to present Rick Wolff here. Dr. Rick Wolff is a graduate of Yale, taught at the University of Massachusetts for almost 30 years, and in the last few years he's been working on the economic crisis, which is started around 2007. And this is what his talk is on tonight, about the status of this. And this is something, there's a lot of disparity about the views. Is the economy getting better? Is it getting worse? What are we looking at? So this is one perspective that I hope you enjoy. So with this, bring in Dr. Rick Wolff.
Normally I could jump right in, but I've got to be a little careful tonight. Can everybody hear me all right? Yes? Okay. Normally I would jump right in, but I have to say a couple of things first. And the first one is that what I'm going to describe to you is what has been going on and is now going on in the United States economy, which is where most of you are going to try to make a living and going to live out the rest of your life. And much of what I say is going to be difficult to hear if you haven't heard it before, and it's going to be difficult to hear if you have heard it before. And I want you just to remember that I am just the messenger. If what you learn about the American economy troubles you, please don't get mad at me. I'm just describing what's going on. But I have a freedom, which is the freedom that comes from not being a paid radio or television announcer. So I don't have to make up the stories that pass for news there. And I'm not running for any office, so I don't have to get you to like me by telling you something you would wish would be the case. But I'm going to assume that you're here because you're actually interested in how we got into the current mess and where we're going. So with that, let me take the time I have to take you on a bit of a whirlwind tour through the American economy as it has evolved over the last 30 years, because that's really the least amount of history we can do to get a perspective on what's happened. First of all, so we're all on the same page. This is the worst economic collapse in the American economy in my lifetime, and I'm older than most of you, which means it's the worst economic collapse in your lifetime, at least so far. The last time the United States had anything like this was something called the Great Depression of the 1930s. That one lasted 11 years. We are now in year 3 of this one. Those of you who think that long-term economic downturns don't happen, unfortunately, history does not support you. The last one, like I said, in this country was 11 years, and in case you think that's a long time ago, the third largest economy, it was the second largest at the time, Japan, in 1989, had a collapse, and they're still in it. So they can last a real long time. For example, they can last into the time most of you will be graduating and looking for work, which isn't good news. But this is a very serious business. We have now roughly, just again to get us all on the same page, we now have roughly 20 to 25 million Americans either not working or working under conditions they don't want to work under. Here's what I mean. We have roughly 9 to 10% people unemployed, adults looking for work and unable to find it. The Bureau of Labor Statistics in Washington keeps statistics not just on those who are looking for work but can't find it, but on 2 other categories that they often add to that. The first category are people who are working a part-time job but don't want to. They want a full-time job but they can't find one. They add that number to the people who are adults looking for work and have no work at all. Then they add a third number. By the way, the statistic is called U-6 if you look it up on BLS.gov. The third group are people who used to be called discouraged workers but are now called marginalized marginalized workers. That's a fancy phrase for saying they've looked for so long that they're not looking anymore. They're not working. They've just given up looking. If you add those unemployed, those not looking, and those doing part-time work but wish they had full-time work, the unemployment rate in the United States today is 17%. That's more than 1 out of 6. That means every American family somewhere, brother, cousin, uncle, somebody, is unemployed, not earning the kind of money they want, and therefore a burden on themselves financially, and because they're being unemployed for a much longer time than they used to, being a burden on other members of their family. This is a very serious situation. Unemployment always is, but perhaps you haven't thought through what it means. Here's what we have in the United States today. Something on the order, as I said, of 20 to 25 million people either not working or not working full-time. Side by side with them, we have unutilized resources, tools, equipment, raw materials, office space, factory space. The government keeps a statistic. It's called capacity utilization. How much of our capacity to produce are we actually using? It currently runs around 65 to 70%. In other words, a third of our capacity to produce is sitting, gathering rust and dust, while the millions of people who would like nothing better than to work with those tools and equipment on the raw materials aren't allowed to do so. And the end result of that is that we as a nation are deprived of hundreds of billions of dollars worth of goods and services that those unemployed people could be producing, which they would like to do, with the raw materials, tools, and equipment which are sitting idle and rusting. That's not an efficient economic system. That's an economic system that has failed the people who live in it, which are you. Many of the so-called problems we have as a society are a function of, we are told, there not being enough money. Hello? There's not enough wealth? Excuse me. We have all those people who want to work and are trained and equipped to work. We have all those materials ready to go. Of course we have the wealth to solve our problems. We just have an economic system that can't put the people together with the equipment to produce the output we'd all be better off having. You'll all have to think to yourselves how it's possible to live in a society about which I just said what I said and not ask fundamental questions. So let me turn then to the thesis for tonight. I originally provided a title. It had to do with what I call the long-term decline in the American economy and its relationship with the recovery about which we hear in the paper. I provided that title before the events of the last 2 weeks in the remarkable state of Wisconsin, and particularly in its capital in Madison, when tens of thousands of working people, Americans, have been in the streets demonstrating against, basically, the situation of this economic crisis. So if I retitled it tonight, I'd call it The Meaning of Wisconsin, but it's really the same tone, and you'll see why. At the same time that the conditions of unemployment that I described are the case, I was also struck this morning by a report on the Bloomberg Financial News page. For those of you that are interested, it's probably the best source of daily financial news you can get. It's available for free on the internet from the Bloomberg service. Bloomberg service this morning reports that on the Standard & Poor 500, that's 500 of the biggest corporations in the United States, they just announced with great happiness their record profits. They are doing wonderfully. They are going to be raising dividends to their shareholders. That's how wonderful. They talk about recovery, and they're right. They have recovered. they have recovered. In other words, we have an economic system that is not impacting all people or all segments equally, not even close. The reason tens of thousands of people demonstrated in Madison, Wisconsin, was for the following reason. The government, the new governor of Wisconsin, and the legislature, explaining that they had no choice, that's their statement, are cutting government services, all kinds of them, much as the federal government is doing in Washington. They are laying off teachers, police officers, firefighters, social workers, groundskeepers, prison wardens, you name it. So let's do this again. We are a nation with an unemployment problem of enormous proportions, and the state of Wisconsin's response is to make more people unemployed. We are a society in which mass unemployment is forcing more and more people to rely on government services more than they usually do, and the governor of Wisconsin is cutting the government services because it's the time when people need more of them. If that sounds to you like an economic system that isn't working real well, you've understood. But of course, you could choose to imagine that the best human response possible to a period of unemployment and popular need for services is to increase the unemployment and cut the services. We'll come back to that. How did the United States get itself into this situation? Well, I think we've been, for 30 years or more, in a unique place here in the United States. We're in an economic situation in which a long part of our history is coming to an end, and a new phase is beginning. But because it's frightening, and because it's different from what we've had, we're taking a real long time to come to terms with it, to admit it. And here the model you might want to keep in mind is that of our once parent country, the United Kingdom. For most of the history of the world, the United Kingdom was a small, cloudy, damp, dark, unfertile island off the coast of Europe. Then for a while, for a number of peculiar reasons, they ruled the world. The 19th century used to refer to England this way: Britannia rules the waves, and if you were of a different cast of mind, Britannia waves the rules. It took a minute. England became a really important country, empires around the world. Hundreds of millions of people in India subordinated to this little, small, offshore island of Europe. Well, starting about 75, 80 years ago, England began marching back to being a small, damp, offshore island. This has been very hard on the British people. They actually try to believe, many of them, that they're still a really important player in the world economy. It's painful how hard they try. For us here in the United States, we can smile. But look a little closer in the mirror, and they, as I'm going to argue, are us. It's coming along a little later. So here's the basic story. For those 150 years, from around 1820 to 1970, the United States was a very successful capitalism. Our businesses did real well, made a lot of money, reinvested it. There was always a shortage of labor. The local people we found here, we didn't want to have work, and we didn't like them, and they returned the favor, and that didn't work out real well. So the way we had workers to be hired by businessmen and women was to bring immigrants here. We are a nation of immigrants. And immigrants came in huge numbers to the United States to take advantage of the remarkable fact that wages were high here and that capitalist employers kept raising the wages. They raised them to bring people here to work, and they raised them once those people were here to prevent them from running off to the West to take the free land and to become their own farmers. So for 150 years, wages in America rose. Stunning. Capitalism delivered the goods to the American working class better than it did anywhere in the world. Helped to generate this idea that the United States is a special place where things happen that are really good, and we must be the apple of somebody's eye to have such a good story work. Americans got used to having a better standard of living each generation. Our kids will live better than we, and our grandkids still better. It's in the cards. It's in something American. Gave us a pretty swelled head as a nation. In the 1970s, all of that stopped. And I don't think most Americans, and I won't embarrass anyone in this room, but that means most folks here too, have understood what that means. The real wage of an American worker, the average wage in the United States, how much you can actually buy of goods and services for an average hour of your work, is the same today as it was in 1978. That was never true before. We've had 30 years of no increase in wages at all. The only reason American families didn't experience that, well, there were two reasons. One, nobody spoke about it, which is why so many of you are looking at me now wondering, because you didn't know that. There was no discussion of this. No admission that we as a society were about to have to go through a big, tough time. Because a country that gets used to rising wages for 150 years is not about to quickly accommodate a situation when that's no longer the case. So American working people didn't respond to the end of rising wages by saying, wow, we have to have a conversation, we have to talk about it amongst ourselves, we have to plan for how to handle this traumatic change. No, instead the American people did as they often do faced with a social problem. They handled it individually. Here's the two things the American people did. Number one, to deal with the fact that the adult male in the house was not earning any more wages, in a family that still wanted to deliver the American dream to their children, give them a better life than they had, who wanted to provide a college education for their children, and a nice home, and a nice diet, and a nice vacation. How are you going to do that if your wages weren't going up anymore? First thing, do more work. More hours. Not only have the father do more hours, but as part of a women's liberation movement that took root in the 70s, women go out to work. Huge social change in America. The mass of women become focused on a career and a job. Paid job. Men and women. Then the old people come out of retirement and the teenagers have a job. Here's a statistic for you to think about. According to the OECD, a major source of good data in this subject, the American working people do more hours of paid labor per year than any other working class on this planet. We work ourselves ... With mother gone to work alongside Papa, with so many hours of labor, you know what suffers starting the last 30 years? Family life. Because the women staying home used to hold the family together emotionally. And now they're just as tired coming home from work as the husband is. For 30 years we've been obsessing about family values, unable or unwilling to recognize that it's very hard to hold a family together if everybody's working themselves to death. People are on edge, tensions rise, exhaustion takes over. Americans are 5% of the world's population, and we consume 66% of psychotropic drugs. Tranquilizers, calmers. Wow, that's right. Is it because we are all drug crazed? Don't answer me. No, it's because we're under pressure. We're no different from other people, but there's a reason why we turn. And you know who the biggest user of legal and illegal drugs in the United States is? Adult women. A lot of pressure there. Was that enough to solve the problem? Did the American family have a rising standard of living if they offset flat wages with more hours? No. Wasn't enough. So the American working class became a new kind of pioneer 30 years ago. We became the first working class to go into a massive level of unsustainable debt. We worked ourselves to death, and then we borrowed ourselves into oblivion. 30 years ago, credit cards were only used by wealthy people who had an American Express card from their business. 30 years ago, it was necessary to put credit into the hands of every single American as fast as possible. That's why you have all those pieces of plastic in your wallet now. We had to invent new ways to hook the American people on credit so they could increase their spending even though they were no longer getting the rising wages, which for the previous 150 years had made that possible. So here's what we shouldn't be surprised at. If this started in the 70s, as it did, by 2007, the following sentence is true. The American working class is physically exhausted, psychologically dependent on chemicals, stressed because of the transformation of their families, and carrying a level of debt and the corresponding anxiety which are simply too much. So of course in 2007 the pot blew. People couldn't pay any more of those debts. They couldn't stand the condition they were in. This is not a temporary downturn. This is not a business cycle blip. This is the culmination of a 30 to 35 year process that has put the vast majority of people in a financially untenable position. But, as I told you at the beginning, what may be bad news for some players in this game is not so bad for others. Let's take a look at the employer. How have the employers done in the last 30 years? Well, this is simple to explain. Over the last 30 years, as I've already told you, the wages paid to the workers is basically flat. Workers get per hour today what they got in 1978. But over those 30 years, while the wages, what employers pay workers, is flat, let's ask the question, what about what employees do for their employer? In economics, we call that productivity. How much stuff per hour does the average worker produce for the employer? You know how work is. You go to work, you use your brains and muscles to produce things, and then at the end of the day, you go home, and those things stay there. Workers became more productive every year over the last 30 years. Every year, because they were better trained, better educated, had better or more machinery, they were more productive. We were very proud of our rising productivity. Okay, you don't need to have rocket science background to understand this. If for 30 years what the employer gives the worker is flat, but what the worker gives the employer is rising, then it's a good time to be an employer. Because the employers keep the difference between what the worker produces for the employer that the employer sells and what the employer pays the worker. The last 30 years were a boom for American business. Tough for the American worker, a boom for the American business. What did the businesses do? I told you what the workers did with their flat wages. They worked more hours, they borrowed more money. You have that in your mind. Let's ask what the employers did. Let's take a quick look. First, the employers were ecstatic. Year after year, their profits grew because they got more and more from their workers, but they didn't pay them anymore. But being kind of cocky fellows, our employers didn't want to suggest either to themselves or to the public that the reason they were doing so well is because you weren't doing so well. Instead, they developed a cult. It's the cult of the genius executive. It turned out that these stunning profits were the fruit of the entrepreneurial genius of people like, we had cult figures, Lee Iacocca, Jack Welch, GE. We developed the idea that these profit increases of business, because we had such fantastic businessmen and women at the helm of our corporations. That's a much nicer story to tell than we were able to get away with not paying our workers anymore while we got more productivity out of them. But it wasn't just in order to tell a nicer story. Here comes the punchline. If you believe the rising profits of the company are not the result of paying workers no more, the way you did for 150 years, the way you had to, if you're getting away with a flat wage while you get more out of them, if instead of admitting that you tell the story, no, this is my entrepreneurial genius, then you justify what began to happen in the 1970s. The beginning of paying to the top executives wild amounts of money in annual salaries and bonuses and stock options. 2 years ago, in the midst of the crisis, when Americans became angry that the executives at Goldman Sachs were giving themselves huge amounts of money when the average American wasn't doing so well, Americans got angry. It was good. I enjoyed their getting angry. I was just sorry it was 30 years late. This is an old phenomenon. But when you're floating in money the way American employers were, and by the way, they were floating everywhere, not just Wall Street, but up and down Main Street, just the same. So one thing they did is pay themselves stunning amounts of money. Top executives became so rich, we had to develop a whole new industry that does nothing but cater to rich people who are accumulating so much money that they need a professional money manager to take care of it. And the people you hire to manage your bundle got a new name. They're called hedge funds. And there was money to be made there, handling the money to be made off of the American economy. Second thing that American businesses did, they were so flush with money they could afford to do something very expensive. If you shut down a production facility in New Jersey or Florida or Arkansas and move it to China, you have a lot of expenses. You have to shut a plant down, you have to sell the equipment, you have to reroute your supply lines, you have to move personnel, you have to buy property abroad, you have to manage all the negotiation. It's very expensive. Now they had so much money they could afford to do it, and they knew it was smart because they could get the work done in China for 1/4 of what it cost to have it done here in the United States. So starting in the 1970s, we had a massive exodus of jobs out of the United States, which again helped to make it unnecessary to raise anybody's wages, because Americans were getting desperate for the jobs that were no longer here in the numbers they had been before. Third thing companies did with all their money, they went into politics. This is really interesting. Average Americans had been involved in politics quite considerably over that whole period, 1900 to 1970. Political clubs, civic associations. But under the pressure of all that extra work and all that extra tension and all that extra anxiety about debts, the American working class had withdrawn from politics. There's a wonderful book, if you've never read it, I would recommend to you, by a fellow at Harvard, a sociologist named Robert Putnam. Funny title of the book, it'll help you remember it. The book is called Bowling Alone. It's a description about how the American, by the way, not a leftist or a radical, a very nice man, appropriate for Harvard as it is for him. And his study as a sociologist was simple. He began to survey that Americans were no longer participating in any kind of civic activity. where once upon a time they had participated in huge numbers in bowling leagues, they were now bowling alone. That's the title of his book. But I'm interested in, they withdrew from politics. They didn't have the time. They didn't have the energy. They were exhausted. And as they withdrew from politics, the people making money off their exhaustion moved right in. And our politics changed from one of fairly large mass participation through 1,000 organizations, including political clubs, into a politics where everything is about how much money you could raise to pay for all the television, which is now the substitute for how you communicate with people rather than mass organizations. American politics didn't shift to the right. Didn't shift at all. What you had is the left, the mass base of the Democratic Party, withdrew. And the money base, largely the Republican Party, came in and filled the vacuum as it does to this day. That's why our politics shifted. What else did the rich do with the money? And if I can get this last one across to you, you will understand our economic system perhaps better than anything else I can tell you. It might have occurred to you a few moments ago when I explained how the American working class borrowed a lot of money. More than any working class ever had before, although a number of countries have caught up to us since, but not before. You might have wondered to yourself for a moment, who lent them the money? Get ready, here we go. The same employers who didn't pay them more wages and thereby accumulated all the money turned around and took a portion of it to lend to the American working class. That's where a lot of the money to lend to them came from. So let's make sure you get this. The American employer stopped raising the wages of workers the way they had over 150 years. Instead, they lent them the money. So the American family could continue to consume, but with this little arrangement, you're rising money to pay for consumption wasn't wages. It was borrowed money. The employer now got you twice. The profit off your work and the interest off the loan you had to take, which he provided. No wonder our country became much more unequal in its distribution of wealth and income over the last 30 years compared to what it was. This is a remarkable event. How was this managed? It was managed by having wealthy people, those who got those big salaries, and rich corporations, buy fancy new financial instruments. I won't bore you with them. Credit default swaps and other things like that, which we can talk about later if you're interested. But that's how they poured money, which found its way into the hands of families to get mortgages, which they turn out they can't afford, or to get credit card debt, which they turn out to be unable to pay back, or student loans, which they're having trouble, all the rest. That's how it was handled. And the rich got excited because they were making money like bandits. And like always happens in capitalism, when the small, the rich become suddenly much richer, is they get excited about speculating and making even more. So we had the most dangerous of combinations. A working class becoming exhausted and deep in debt, and an employer class paying itself fantastic salaries and speculating in money. And it all blew up in 2007, 2008. How did the government react? How did we all react when it all fell apart? Particularly in the last few months of 2008, there was complete panic in this country in all the decision-making areas. And all the decision-making areas means New York and Washington. Panic. The economy was in the kind of meltdown some of us are worried are happening in those reactors in Japan. Terrible at what that might mean. And so we did something really interesting. Having spent 30 years celebrating the genius of private enterprise, the genius of the executive who lead private enterprise, We now face the complete meltdown of the economic system that we got when we left more than ever before to private enterprise and pulled the government out. And so we did what we have done as a nation every other time our economic system has started to tank. We turned to the government to bail them out. And because this is a big one, we bailed them out big time. Here's what happened. The government of the United States, the federal government, suddenly decided it had to throw unspeakable amounts of money at the biggest banks in the country, the biggest insurance company in the world, the biggest car company in this country, General Motors, and a bunch of others. It had to step in and support the housing industry by basically guaranteeing or being the final lender for every mortgage written in the country, and that's been true for the last 2.5 years. There is no housing market in the United States without the support of the federal government. Our banks are effectively nationalized. Because we can't face it, we pretend otherwise. General Motors is a car company owned by the United States government. AIG, the largest insurance company in the world, is completely owned by the United States government. Banking, insurance, automobiles, and housing. That's about it. You would like to make a pretense we have a private enterprise economy, please go ahead, but you live in the same place. But then, of course, you do live in the same place. It's kind of a joke I make elsewhere in the country, as Disneyland. Anyway, it is a pretense. We turn to the government to bail us out. And the government did. It spent a fortune of money, counted in the trillions with a T. We had never seen that before. That exceeds by far the amount of money that Roosevelt spent in the 1930s. Wow. Nobody said a word. Republicans and Democrats brought the government in. George Bush was still the president. A Republican brought the government in. Obama did the same thing, bigger. You know who led it? The banks. They wanted the government to come in because they knew they were done. They had made loans to people who couldn't possibly pay back. They had invested money into enterprises that could never pay it back, and they knew real well how desperate they were. Who made all these bad loans? The banks. What's the job of a bank in economics? The job of the bank is to take other people's money that's deposited there and very prudently lend it out, making real sure that the people you lend to can pay it back, because otherwise you'd be taking risks with other people's money that you're not supposed to do. Our banks did a damn good job of that. And when they failed, all across the board, all the biggest ones, they went to the government and they said, we are too big to fail. New idea for many Americans. What exactly does that mean? Well, you see, if you let us collapse, we'll take everything down with us, so it's not smart for you to let us collapse. Give us a lot of money. So we did. One of the biggest two that we gave money to was Bank America, which was too big to fail, and Merrill Lynch, which was too big to fail. And when the dust cleared, a year later, they had merged. So now they are twice whatever too big to fail is. At this point, as I've said before today, if I could, I would interrupt, and for a few moments I'd play stanzas of the national anthem, just so we appreciate what I'm describing to you. Nobody said boo. Republicans and Democrats voted for the government to do this. I know today it's fashionable to say, well, the government is acting irresponsible. This is a fresh insight. The same politicians that are telling you that now all voted for this, right down the line. Well, here's a problem. If the government's going to bail out the private sector with tons and tons of money, and if everybody votes for it, there's an interesting question that nobody asked. Where's the money going to come from? Who's going to pay for this? No, we had to save our economy, we had to step in there, we had to. So nobody was supposed to be so uncouth as to say, gee, where's the money going to come from? Well, let's see, there's three ways the government can get money. Number one, it could tax people. If you think the government was unpopular by bailing out the richest people in the world, the biggest corporations, you think it was unpopular doing that. Imagine how unpopular it would have have been if the president, either Bush or Obama, had gone on TV and said, I've bailed them all out and it's costing each and every one of you $25,000. You got 2 weeks to pay. The things they would have done, either to Bush or Obama, polite conversation doesn't allow me to speculate on what would happen. So they didn't do that. Ever the courageous ones leading our country, they weren't going to tax people because that was too dangerous. Okay? Second way, you could just print a lot of money. That gives the government money. Print it. The trouble is that gets people around the world real nervous. Turns out a lot of people around the world own things denominated in dollars. For example, the United States, having borrowed a lot of money, including in this crisis, but even before, to run its business, has had to borrow more and more from other parts of the world. I assume you all know that. The United States is now by far the biggest debtor country in the world. We're number one, maybe not number one where you thought, but number one on who owes other people. No other country comes close. But if you think that's good, here's another piece of news. Who's the country that is most our creditor? From whom have we as a nation borrowed the most? No, folks. The People's Republic of China. So let me explain what that means. The biggest, most powerful communist country in the world is the largest creditor of the biggest, most powerful capitalist country in the world. I told you, I didn't make this up. Don't get angry at me. I had nothing to do with this. But that is the case. And you know what that means? It means that every year, since the debt of the United States to China is in the order of $1.5 trillion, that's a lot of money. Number one, China. Number two, Japan. Number one, China. If we owe them $1.6 trillion, and if the overwhelming bulk of that is the government's debt to them, then it means that every year the United States government is raising $50 to $60 billion in taxes that you pay. And on behalf of the People's Republic of China, I want to thank you. Because the taxes you pay are collected by Washington and sent as interest to the People's Republic of China, which therefore gets more money from the United States, many times more money than the total outlay of foreign aid by the United States to the entire rest of the world. And if I had time, I'd play the national anthem again. Sound like an economic system that's got everything under control? Oh yeah, big time. Well, if you can't print money because it's going to be dangerous, here's what's left. You borrow the money. And that's what the United States government has been doing. It's been borrowing the money to bail out our economy. And who has it borrowed the money from? Well, I already told you part of the story. From other countries. Big time. But here's another part of the story. Who lends money to the United States government? Well, it turns out that the average American doesn't, because the average American doesn't have any extra money to lend to the government or anybody else. Big lender to the United States government, wealthy people. Rich, big corporations, they're major lenders. So let's see now how this goes. The United States government bails out rich people and corporations, particularly the corporations. It could have raised the money by taxing them, the rich and the big corporate. But it didn't. It didn't. Instead, it borrowed the money. From whom? From them. Let's do this again. Instead of corporations and the rich paying taxes to the government, they lent the government the money. And as if that weren't enough, while lending the government money, they gave speeches that you all watched, saying that a government should learn to live within its means. Huh? We are now in Disneyland, only it's everywhere. It's everywhere. Let me talk to you for 3 minutes about taxes in the United States, because I doubt, unless you've been very well trained, that you are familiar with this. Because I want you to understand what it meant to bail out corporations and the rich, to give them the recovery that the Standard & Poor 500 statistic I gave you at the beginning refers to bail them out by giving all the money to the banks, creating a stock market recovery. These are the people who brought us the crisis. They're the people who've been bailed out and who have recovered. Let's now take a look at this thorny question of taxes. First, let's begin with corporations. Here's a statistic for you to think about. In the 1940s, the federal government got 50% more of its revenue from taxes on corporations than from taxes on individuals. 50% more from corporations than it gets from individuals. What's the relationship today? Corporations today pay 25% of the amount raised from individuals. The last 50 years have seen a massive shift of the burden of the federal government's revenue from corporations to individuals. But we're not halfway there. Now let's take a look at what happened to individuals. How did things go there? Well, here's something for you to think about. In the 1950s and 60s, what was the top rate paid by the richest people on the income tax they had to pay on the income they earned? 91%. Let me explain to you what that means. Everybody who got over the top amount, let's say it was 100,000, somewhere in that area, for every dollar over 100,000 that a person got, and 100,000 in those days meant you were very rich indeed, but we had plenty of people who did that. Every dollar over 100,000 that you earned, you had to give Uncle Sam 91 cents. You kept 9 cents. You with me? Even as late as the 1970s, it was 70 or 71%. So every dollar over the maximum, the richest people paid 71 cents and kept 29 cents for themselves. What's the rate today? The top rate of the federal income tax, 35%. You all with me? The biggest tax cut in the world came from the richest Americans, who dropped from 91% to 35%. Here, therefore, is a hot idea for you. If we just went back to the ratio of corporate to individual taxes and put back on the rich people the tax that they were paying for decades in the United States, decades during which Republicans and Democrats regularly voted for these high rates. I'm not describing Russia or any other place like that to you. I'm describing the United States. If we went back to where we once were, guess what? The government would be raking in money from corporations and the rich, and we wouldn't have to have anything like the deficits we have today. We don't have a deficit because we don't have the money. We have a deficit because we have relieved the corporations and the rich of even the burdens we used to levy on them. They have been able to shift the burden off of corporations onto individuals, and from the richest individuals onto everybody else. Check the numbers. I didn't make it up. So you have to ask yourself, let's do the arithmetic again. The corporations and the rich speculated, lent money, didn't pay taxes. We have an economic explosion. We bail them out with an enormous amount of money. They still don't pay taxes. We borrow the money from them to help bail them out. And now we're told, from President Obama to the governor of Wisconsin to everybody else, gee, we have a fiscal crisis, and the solution is to lay off public employees and cut back services. Make old people wait longer to retire after a lifetime of work to get their Social Security. Cut back nutrition supplements to pregnant women, the Head Start program for disadvantaged kids. You gotta be kidding. But I'm not kidding. I didn't make any of this up. How would I summarize this? We are in a situation of a long-term shift of the American economic system from what it was to something new. And let me summarize what it was. This was once a very profitable economic place to do capitalist business. And because of the labor shortage, it drove up wages. When that was no longer necessary, when the computer replaced so many people, when jobs abroad became a good investment, we didn't have a labor shortage anymore, and as all good business manuals tell you, if you don't have to raise the wages of your workers, don't do it. And our corporate leaders had been to business school, they didn't do it. Taxes were shifted over the last 50 years, from business to people, from the richest to the middle and the bottom. Of course there's been a tax revolt. Not because our taxes are too high. Compared to most countries in Europe, for example, our total tax is lower than theirs, and has been for a long time. We had a tax revolt because the mass of people had the tax burden shifted on them. And because they didn't understand it, they thought the problem was the government taxing, rather than understanding the problem was the government taxing exactly who, and not taxing who. Meanwhile, corporations were making a fortune, not only off the flat wages, because they didn't have to pay higher wages, but by moving out of the United States. Again, a little factoid to keep in your mind. Many of you know that we are now importing an enormous array of things from China. Clothing, appliances, soon the automobiles will start coming, and so on. 60% of the goods that come from China are produced in subsidiaries of American corporations producing in China. It's American companies who thought, why not sell the American people goods we can produce much more cheaply in China than it would cost us to produce them here? So they closed their factories and they moved to China. Oh yes, and one detail. It's very cheap to produce in China, but there is a problem. How do you distribute all those cheap goods in China? For China to have worked this deal with American companies, come over here, we'll provide you cheap labor and you can produce it, sell back into the United States, and boy will you make a lot of money. There were two problems. One problem, small problem that didn't slow any corporation down, was a little detail. If you produce it on the other side of the globe, you're going to have to bring it here. And in a nation that's beginning to take seriously an ecological problem, you're going to be wasting huge amounts of energy to move that stuff halfway around the world. So it might be good for your profits, but it's not going to be good for the environment. Who cares? So that was done. Second problem. How do you distribute it in the United States? How do you get all those cheap Chinese goods, good quality, low price to produce, how do you distribute them all over the United States? You need something, because the Chinese could produce real well, good quality, low price, but they didn't have the distribution system. They needed an American partner, and one was ready to go. The name of this company is Walmart. 30 years ago, when China was just beginning its industrialization, it was a poor, backward country. 30 years ago, Walmart was a poor, backward department store in no place at all, Arkansas. Excuse me, Bentonville, Arkansas. Over the last 30 years, there's been a partnership. Walmart will distribute the Chinese products across America into every town. Walmart made the Chinese industrial miracle possible. Just like China made the Walmart miracle possible. China gave Walmart the cheap stuff with which to undercut everybody else. Walmart gave China a distribution system. They are partners in moving a massive amount of production from the United States over into China. Good for Walmart, good for China. End of story. But now in the last 5 to 10 years, last step of this saga, American corporations are discovering something. and you really ought to pay attention to this, if nothing else. They're discovering that when you move your production out of the United States on the scale that we've done, when you impoverish the mass of your people relative to the tiny number who are doing real well, the way we have done, there are economic consequences. Every American corporation that I know, with very few exceptions, is basically arriving at the following conclusion, and they've been doing this for some years now. The American working class is tapped out. They're too in debt. They're too exhausted. Their wages are going nowhere at all. High unemployment means there can't be any increase in wages. Their wages aren't going anywhere. Their debts are too much for them. That's half of why we're in this problem. So that's not only a situation where we as corporations are not going to produce in America anymore. We're going to go to where it's cheaper. But here's the new thing. We're not aiming at the American consumer as our primary target. We're going to aim elsewhere. The growth in the market is happening in those places we move production to. India, China, and other parts of the world. Our future is not only producing elsewhere, other than the United States, but increasingly selling elsewhere than the United States. If a company, whether it be called Pepsi-Cola or Caterpillar or GM or Ford, if a company is more and more producing outside the United States and more selling and seeing the growth of its market outside the United States, here's what it doesn't care so much about anymore. You. You're not the primary focus. Their future lies elsewhere. And that means for the American working class becoming the background noise, the hinterland. Yes, we'll still have our metropolitan cities, our centers of whatever industry we can hold on to. But there's an increasing sense that the average American people are going to be a not very much consuming, not very well employed, not very well off mass of other people, rather like what we have in so many other countries. The special position of the United States, which stopped in the 1970s, but whose impact was postponed by work and debt and speculation, is no longer being postponed. There is a long-term economic decline proposal. The reason the Standard & Poor's 500 corporations are reporting record profits at the same time that so many people are unemployed, so many people are losing their homes. 1.5 million people will be thrown out of their homes this year. That's more than last year. Is that those corporations are producing elsewhere and selling elsewhere. They can, of course, do very well in their activities elsewhere. It doesn't matter to them that the rest of the United States isn't. That's not their problem anymore the way it once was. Well, they had to be concerned because they produced here. And they had to be concerned because they depended on consumption here. They don't. Less and less with each day. The punchline of this is the following. When capitalism in America delivered the goods, it proudly told us, we are a great country because we have a capitalism that delivers the goods. Rising wages, 150 years. Tough argument to refute. But over the last 30 years, and especially over the last 3 during this crisis, capitalism is not a system that's delivering the goods. It's delivering the bads. Lots of them in a kind of cascading waterfall. Now, we can be like the British. We can decide not to think of it, not to see it, not to worry about it, pretend it isn't happening. Spend a lot of time at Disneyland. We can. But it probably won't solve our problem. It certainly didn't solve the problem of Britain's decline. And the alternative is to look this situation in the face and ask ourselves the following questions. We've organized an economic system in the following way. The vast majority of people go to work 5 days a week, use their brains and muscles to produce goods for their employer. At the end of the day, they go home. At the end of the week, they collect a wage. Meanwhile, the employer, a corporation with a board of directors of 15 to 20 people, makes the following decisions: what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the profits that come from the production. And they've been making decisions that include the following: moving your job to another country, lending money to the government, using their money to establish facilities in other countries where it's more profitable, lending the money to workers whose wages haven't gone up so they can try to buy something which basically they can't afford. That's what they've been doing. You're now going to live with the consequences. We can complain about them, we can whine about them. I go around the country explaining it to people like I've tried to do with you. But explanation isn't going to change it. We have to do in the United States what we've been afraid to do for 50 years. We have to interrogate our economic system. We have to ask and debate the question: can the United States do better than the capitalist system it has? Because the one we have requires me to paint the picture I've just painted for you, which I don't want to do. I'm a real nice, happy-go-lucky fellow. I don't like saying this sort of stuff. But, unless you want me to repeat what you can get anyway from your elected officials or from the TV, which would be about as interesting as the first time you hear it from those jokers, I'm going to tell you something that is at least the way I see it. And that means we have to ask that question. We have to ask whether we do really want to live in a system that's making decisions this way, especially when the mass of people like you and me have to live with these decisions and have no influence over them whatsoever. It's an important question. The only reason we haven't debated it is because in our country, the legacy of the Cold War means that to ask these kinds of questions and to raise these kinds of issues is somehow disloyal. Well, I guess I disagree. To pretend that these are not the issues we have as a nation strikes me as a much more severe kind of disloyalty to whatever it is you hope this society can become, whether it's just for yourself or for the community of which you are a part. You're not going to solve this problem by pretending it isn't there. The corporations are making their decisions. I'm not one for blaming this or that. I don't think the bankers are the problem or the Federal Reserve. I don't find any of that per se. This is a system. Bankers do what the system has them do. That's what they're hired to do. That's what they do. That's what corporations do. That's what working people do. They play by the rules of the system. And if the outcome stinks, then it's time to question the system. Why should it be sacrosanct? Why should it be so hard to ask? Other countries are asking. Let me give you an example, just so you know. The country in Europe that is closest to the United States now, in every way, economically speaking, is Germany. It is now the center of Europe, by far the most powerful and most advanced economic system. They've come through this crisis really pretty well, certainly compared to the United States. Here's an interesting thing for you to think about in the case of Germany. 6 or 7 years ago, a new political party arose in Germany. Funny name. Called itself Die Linke, which in German means the left. Here's one of its basic slogans. Germany can do better than capitalism. Wow. Pretty heavy. The last national election, last year, 2010, that party got 11.9% of the total national vote. 8 Germans believes that Germany can do better than capitalism. Because Germany runs its government differently from the United States, they have something called proportional representation. What that means is the percentage that a party gets of the vote is the same percentage of seats in the parliament that it gets to occupy. So that party occupies 1/8 of all votes on all questions in the German parliament. We don't permit that here in the United States. Or actually, to be a little fairer, in our Democratic and Republican primaries, we allow states to have proportional representation. That's why, if you remember, in some states where Obama got X% and Clinton got Y%, they each got X and Y% of the delegates to the convention from that state. That's proportional representation. We allow it in the primaries, but we don't allow it in the general election. That's why a party here can get 8% of the vote and have absolutely 0% of any say in the actual halls of the legislature. How you square that with democracy is one of the great mysteries. It's sort of like trying to understand why Rudolph has a red nose. I never figured it out, either one of those questions out. But in Germany, a party that questions capitalism is a normal and quite successful part of the political atmosphere. And make no mistake, it is very dangerous not to deal with this question. The gap between rich and poor in the United States is becoming almost as bad as it was a century ago, after having been compressed so that the gap between rich and poor was remarkably small. Those were the days when we celebrated in America that everybody here is in the middle class. We're kind of all the same, a little bit of difference, but we're all in the boat together. Tough argument to make these days when the inequality. Those of you who saw the uprisings and were moved by them in Tunisia, or Egypt, or Libya, or Bahrain, and I could go on, must have noticed that one of the most important issues was the extreme gap between rich and poor in those countries. Well, if it blows up in that country when the extremes become the news, then what do you think it's going to do in our country? We already have straws in the wind. And I can end with Wisconsin one more time. The Wisconsin governor did what many governors are doing, claiming that there's no money, so we have to cut the budget. We owe too much money. Did he tax the corporations? No. 2 months before the crisis hit, he actually lowered taxes on corporations in Wisconsin. Did he tax the rich? Did he ask the government, the federal government, to do that and then help the states with the money they were? None of it. All he could think of was not only to take from the workers many of their job conditions and their wages, which the unions agreed to, but he wanted to go another step. He wanted to take from the working people not just the wages that they had been promised that they gave back, not to make concessions on paying a part of their pensions and their health, which they agreed to. He wanted to take from them the legal right to bargain with their employer over the terms of their job. That is, he wanted to take away from them one of the few weapons they have to shape their own future. That's a very dangerous sign. That's a sign of a change in the landscape. Blaming unions, which I know is a major sport in the United States, somewhere between basketball and hockey. But blaming the unions is so far-fetched. How many of you know that the proportion of private employees in the United States that are in a union? 6.9%. Right? 93.1% of private employees work in a place that has no union. Big, strong unions. You must be kidding. In the public sector, 1/3 of workers are in a union, much higher than the private. But that means that, if my arithmetic is still good, 2/3 are not. 2/3 are not in any union. So if there's a problem with the relationship between employers and employees in the public sector, and 2/3 of the people don't have a union, then blaming the union is, how should we say this politely, a big fat lie. But it works. If you want to believe, you will believe. What we have here is a massive assault on the American working class. The shift of taxes from corporations to people, from the richest individuals down to the middle and the bottom, but particularly the middle. The attack on the unions, the cutting of government services when we need them most, the laying off of public employees. You would have to be blind not to see a pattern here. I used to end my talks by saying, but we are not blind. But people pointed out to me this British example, and I found it persuasive. You can be blind for a long time, but you do so at an enormous, enormous cost. Can all this be turned around? Yeah, but I don't think it can be turned around unless we as a people are beginning, at least finally, to have a debate about an economic system that allows the mass of people to live with the results of economic decisions about what gets produced, where it gets produced, how it gets produced, and what gets done with the profits. If we continue to allow the people who've been doing that for the last 30 years to do it, then we have no one to blame but ourselves if they continue to do it the way they've been doing it, and therefore I will be back here next year to tell you a story that's even more depressing than the one I just told you, which neither you nor I would like to see happen. So we have to ask and answer that kind of question. We have to have the long-delayed debate about this way of organizing production and see whether there might be others that we ought to try, that we ought to develop in order to have a different future than the one being painted for us by the forces around us that are making the decisions that we don't participate in. There's a reason why these kinds of issues are sitting here. This crisis is not about to go away. The mass unemployment, nobody thinks is about to disappear. The home foreclosure disaster rolls on. Every public institution of higher education, I know this is a private school, but every public institution, that's where the vast majority of Americans who go to colleges and universities go. They go to public schools. They're all being cut back. My final thought for you is, think about, with me, what does it mean in this country where all economics professors I know of, myself included, teach our students that in a world economy, which is what we now have, the future of the United States depends on being an effective competitor in this world economy. And nothing is more important, we say, and I think we say it rightly, than the quality and the quantity of our skilled labor force, the creativity and so forth that our working people, men and women, bring to jobs. And where do you think they get the most important part of that training? In colleges and universities. And what are we doing as we go through the current crisis? We are cutting. Let me make sure you understand that. We are cutting our colleges and universities. 12 out of the 15 million people that go to colleges and universities in the United States go to public schools. Those public schools are overwhelmingly financed by state governments, and state governments almost everywhere are cutting. To solve our current problem, we are shooting ourselves in the foot economically for the future. That's an irrational way to cope. But I don't want to end on a sad note. So, let me finish by telling you about one state in the United States that behaved differently and is still behaving differently. One. Here's what the state did, and then I'll tell you what state it is. In 2009, when all state governments were suffering terrible cutbacks in revenue. Why? Because unemployed people don't have a job, that's what it means. And if you don't have a job, you don't earn an income, and if you don't earn an income, you don't pay income tax. And if you and your neighbors and cousins are losing their jobs, you don't spend as freely as you did before, so the state doesn't get as much sales tax. So states were everywhere losing money, and they were starting to cut workers and cut programs because they didn't have any money coming in. They could, of course, have taxed corporations and the rich, but, you know, that's un-American. So everywhere they cut, except this one state. This one state had a governor and a head of the legislature, and they said, we're not going to do that. We're not going to lay off a single public employee, and we're not going to cut any of our programs. People need more government help in a crisis like now, not less. And we sure as hell are not going to lay people off. We already have unemployment. That would only make it worse. So the legislature passed a bill. Can you believe it? First in one house, then in the other. Saying, we are not going to cut services, we're not going to lay off people. Here's what we're going to do. This is one of the 50 American states. We're going to raise taxes on corporations, and we're really going to raise taxes on rich people. Everybody earning over $250,000 a year is going to pay a big, hefty increase, and if you earn over $500,000 a year, wow, are you going to pay a lot more. And first one house of this state legislature passed the bill. Then the other house did. Then they sent it to the governor. He signed it. It became law. However, because this state, I'm giving you a hint now, is on the western part of the United States, they have an annoying law there. Fortunately, most of us in the East don't have this kind of law. It's called the right of instant recall. It means you get a handful of signatures, and if you don't like any bill that the legislature passed and the governor signed, you can force a vote. So everybody in the state has the right to go to the polls, and if a majority disagrees with the governor and the legislature, the law is null and void, doesn't take effect. Only if the majority agree with what the legislature and the governor did, does it finally become a law. So when the legislature and the governor signed it, the business community went nuts, and the Republican Party went nuts twice. And they organized quickly a fundraiser, and they got the signatures, and they forced a vote. I believe it was the 10th of January, 2010, that the people of the state of Oregon went to the polls. 1.2 million Oregonians, and voted clearly and decisively in favor of the bill. So in Oregon, what has happened nowhere else happened. And I'm happy to report Oregon is still here. Lightning did not come down. Evil spirits did not take over. Portland people still drink more coffee than anywhere else on earth. Everybody has their own coffee house, 2 for rich people. They managed it. The unthinkable. Wow. What isn't possible is. But it takes a determination to make that happen. And those ingredients which were present in the state of Oregon could be developed elsewhere in this country if an understanding of the situation combined with a passion to change things, and not for some abstract principle. I am talking about the country in which most of you are going to try to build a life in the years ahead. So changing this country around so the conditions you're facing now will not be looked at as having been good compared to what's coming is an urgent requirement, I think, even for you. Thank you very much for your attention.